I wanted to start out by talking about some ways to increase production efficiency. First, who has sheep? Any sheep people? All goat people?
Your sheep, right?
Sheep,
Sheep?
hair sheep too.
Yeah, I know who you are.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Mark
I
can.
remember you. So hopefully everything will apply to both, but there's a few things that I'll have to make clarifications on, difference in stock. But one of the biggest things when people talk about cost of production and how to improve it is a lot of people don't even know where they're operating at. So when we talk about making improvements, you kind of need to know where you're starting at to make an improvement. So the highest cost of our production in any livestock system is typically going to be feed. Usually accounts for about anywhere from half to about 3/4 of your cost of operating. So usually if you're going to make a big impact, it's going to be a change in your nutrition program. And sometimes that's just going from a bagged feed to getting some bulk source of feed. That can cut costs pretty dramatically, or sometimes it's different ingredients. One of the other things is labor. So I'm guessing relatively small operating size for most of you. Is everybody?
One man show.
Yeah, and that's what I'm guessing, other than children, which is great, because that's usually relatively free labor. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, free.
Yeah, free-ish, yeah. Sometimes it costs you a little bit more than an employee would. But, yeah, so typically that's gonna be a second place that most places can cut costs. And then probably what's going to be second for most of you is facilities. So sometimes an improvement to a facility, it might be a larger upfront cost, but it can cut a cost in the long run. But the main thing is knowing where you're operating at right now to be able to make a cut. So knowing what's accounting for the largest portion of your cost, and then where can you make improvements on that. So this is usually where I ask, do any of you know your cost of production? And that's usually the answer. Usually there's like one person in a room of 50 people that know their cost of production. So, and there's tools that are available to where you can actually calculate that, or at least estimate your cost of production in most cases. But the biggest thing is, when we talk about once you know your cost of production, is knowing where you're going to be losing efficiency. So if that's labor, which for most of you it's probably not, facilities, and then sometimes it's genetics. Sometimes some genetic improvements can lead to some increases in efficiency. But it's not another thing that a lot of us don't take into account. And then the production, amount of production. So what breed of hair sheep do you have?
Crossbred or generations from Joe Hubbard.
Okay, yeah, so that's what I was kind of hoping you would say. So production-wise, it's probably the most highly productive hair sheep breed out there is the Easy Care. Their outputs greatly, I just lost my word, but it's a dramatic difference of what you're inputting into that animal and what they're able to output. Another sheep breed is Polypays. They are very similar in that way. Without putting a lot into them, you get a lot from them. So they usually relatively easily pay for themselves. On the goat side, if you're producing really high quality show boars, your output, what you're putting into them, the cost of producing that animal is going to pay for itself when you start selling them. But that's not always the case. And then of course we have breeds like the Kiko, the Spanish goat, and especially on the dairy side of goats that can be highly, highly productive as far as paying for themselves. And then this is the other thing, is even if you're a one-man show, is knowing how much time you spend and are you actually paying yourself at all. Because I'm a firm believer that even in a hobby type operation, you can still pay yourself, reward yourself for the time you're spending out there, even if you don't have a lot of animals. Okay, this is another one. So how do you raise your sheep? Oh, sorry, I have a typo. Sheep or goats. So usually I get a lot of laughs on this one, but I always like to think of the good times. Like right now, we're just ending our lambing and kidding. We're at the tail end of ours. It's always really fun because you have all these awesome little babies running around and you're wondering what they're going to grow up to be. And for the most part, everything's going really well. It's always the time of the year I look forward to the most. Some people say that they relate to the sheep and goats and they really identify with being in that type of a production setting. Some people like the challenge of raising them. I always say they're better than pigs. That's usually on a bad day, or I'm like, still better than raising pigs. Every day of the week. And it's cheaper than being a cowboy, especially right now. Because I was just reporting for a class some prices on sheep and goats. It's a good time to be in the sheep and goat business. It's not that great of a time to be in the cattle business, especially when you look at sheep and goat prices. Even wool prices are doing pretty good right now, so it's pretty nice. But then, of course, there's the bad days where you have all of your deads and the colds, like it was in February. We had 3 pipes burst in one day. It's not a good day. So really, one of the pipes that burst twice was inside. I might have chewed someone out that day. It was not a good day. Yeah, the no sleep, which luckily I have lots of labor being on campus. Yeah, so I have a lot of students complaining about not getting a lot of sleep right now. So I just had 2 come up to me today at our meeting that said, we're really behind in our classes. We're going to need some time. So we deal with it too. And then the uncertain markets, luckily, we've been doing pretty well the last few years. And then, of course, new and never easy issues like parasites and drugs, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so grass and fence is probably my top 2 questions I get, other than parasites and health problems. But hay or grass is going to be where we make most of our money. And so my number one thing, and I was just telling students this today, because they were all, I've trained them well, I say, is they were asking me, when are we going to get to turn stuff out? Because they've learned when stuff goes out on pasture, they don't have to work as hard. And the sheep and the goats do a lot better. We just have less problems, everything looks better, everything does better, it's great. And they're having to do less work, so we're making more money because they're just eating stuff that's coming up out of the ground. It's awesome. So just let sheep, goats do what they're meant to do. Whether that's grass, if you have browse available, that's awesome too for the goats. And even if you have people around you that have undesirable grasses, and getting sheep and goats onto that, it's a great way to utilize the resources you have available and not spend money. So this is a big one for goats, but can be for sheep too. It's controlling feed waste. So having good bunk lines, if you're feeding from a bunk, or if you're feeding on a skirt, being able to control push up feed. Feed what they need, not what they want. So that's sometimes a hard one for people. I see way more fat sheep and goats than I do skinny ones. So it's a hard thing to teach people. Because I always get they look really hungry. And and you shake a pail of corn or whatever and they all start dying and sound like they're dying. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily need it. And then anytime we can limit access to big packages, so like round bales, because especially on the goat side, they're gonna waste that. And so limiting their ability to waste feed when we have them inside can really benefit us on a cost basis. So this goes down to the ingredient thing. So if you can find a cheaper substitute for certain ingredients, so a lot of people feed soybean meal. It's easy to feed, safe to feed. But I always tell people, once you get comfortable feeding sheep and goats and you don't have accidents feeding them, you can kind of start experimenting with different ingredients that you haven't had before. So another safe one, corn gluten feed, is pretty safe. It's pretty much always cheaper than soybean meal. And it's a good energy supplement. Distiller's grains is another one. You can't supplement it at the same level as soybean meal, but it's a great substitute for a certain portion of the diet, and great energy feed, great protein feed too. And so it's a little riskier to feed, not quite as safe, but you can still feed that. Soybean hulls is a great filler feed if you can get your hands on it. I think the price of that is starting to go up a little bit, but still usually pretty available. And then any of our hays, if we can get our hands on some higher quality hays. I put this in here. It's not available as an app anymore. They took it away as an app, but it's still available on the website. So that link is still good. And I'll get this to Jody so she can get it to you guys. But that link, you can actually plug in different ingredients that you might want to feed. And it'll tell you the cost of using that feed on an energy basis, on a protein basis. So you're not just looking at just the feed cost. And so it takes into account the efficiency of feeding that feed. So this is what that website would look like. So this has distillers and then wet distillers. So it gives you the feed cost per ton, the shipping cost per ton. You can do it on a delivered basis. And then it has it on a protein basis, TDN or energy basis, and then a net energy basis too on cost. So it's pretty handy. I really like the website. And I've used it quite a bit for different things, and I'm looking at changing out ingredients. Then the other thing is separating into management groups, and this one is not realistic for everyone. You need pen access for this. But if you can manage either your doelings versus your mature does, or ewes, ewe lambs versus mature ewes into different groups, because the mature ewes don't need as much feed as those doelings or ewe lambs that are still growing. So even if it's on pasture, putting the younger ones onto a better, higher quality pasture so that your inputs are actually going into the ones that need it, versus those mature animals that just don't need it as much. Another management group that you can distinguish between is if they're bred with singles versus twins or more. Those that are bred with those multiples are going to need more inputs versus those singles where you're kind of just throwing money away. And then this is something that we do regularly, but separating out our thin, average versus fat animals. So we always have a thin group because we keep around some older sheep and goats just because we're trying to grow our numbers. So we have our older ewes and does that get spoiled because we'll separate them out because they're thin and we feed them a lot more. But they can't push their way into the bunk as well anymore, and they just need more feed to maintain. So versus some of our fat ones that we'll sort off and we feed them a lot less. And so for that, it saves us a little bit on our feed bill.
Have you guys tried that new limiting feeder, self-feeder that supposedly makes them so they can only eat 1 pound a day? And
I haven't. I thought about it, but right now with the budget cuts and stuff for us, we can't buy new feeders and everything, so.
we can't either.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? Yeah, we're all kind of in the same boat. Yeah, so I haven't tried it. I want to try it because I've heard some good things about them, but I don't.
It's actually the feeder or supplement?
It's a feeder.
Yeah, it's a feeder. It's
Oh.
As I understand it, and I saw it, I don't know how that works, is they gotta reach their tongue down, and when the tongue gets
Yeah.
dry, they can't eat.
yeah, yeah.
Huh.
They have to like lick under it, and there's a little mechanism at the bottom of the feeder because it's really just a self feeder, but it has I don't know. There's a piece in there that cuts them off.
Interesting.
Time feeders,
Yeah.
see the time feeders that will stop at a certain time?
Uh-huh.
Or like the one with the collars.
Yeah, this one isn't the collared one. It's I'm trying to remember the name of it.
It was a foreign made, one
Yeah.
I was familiar with,
Yeah.
and I know one guy's trying it, and he said it's management, you gotta keep them clean so
Yeah.
they build up,
Yeah, they'll stick at the bottom.
yeah, and so consequently you have to keep them clean, but he thinks it's working pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
But they are expensive.
Yep, they are expensive. Yep. But I've heard they work. But we feed twice a day anyway, and so and we have lots of pen space, so we can control everything anyway. So it's not too big of a deal for us, but yeah, in places where you don't have that capability, it's good. I think that they work. And I think this is a big one too, because so sheep especially have a really high salt tolerance. So they will just eat and eat and eat mineral. Goats can be pretty bad about it too. And so with sheep, you actually need to put more salt in it if you're using that to control mineral intake.
What's the
Or-
percent salt that you find is for limiting feed if you want to feed 1 pound a day?
So sheep can
How much salt do you put in the ration?
tolerate like 1 to 1.5% of their diet as salt.
Wow.
Yeah. So you need to get above like up to 2 if you're using it as a limiter.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. But sheep can pretty much drink seawater. It's crazy. But we just limit feed our mineral. We just top dress all of our feed with it, or else we're just constantly going through mineral when we have everything up. But it's good to know, monitor your intake levels, read the label so that you know what they are required to actually consume of that certain mineral. If you can buy it in bulk, that's great. I
you
know.
said-
Go ahead, no.
I know you said top feeders, I've been in a lot of conversations where feed loose minerals, or free feed them, or put in their feed. We put in their feed. I've always been told that's probably not a good idea, just
Yeah.
to give them a mineral feeder and they'll eat what they need and,
Yep.
you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big advocate of providing it just free. But a lot of times they just start going through it so fast and they're eating way more than they actually need. And so that's where I say,
So you think they will eat it even if they don't need it?
Yeah.
yeah,
I've heard many people say if they don't need it, they won't eat it. And I don't, maybe it's just my goats, I don't know, but I just
No.
don't handful in their feed just to make sure it's
Yeah.
limited for one thing and they're getting it.
yeah. And I think it's just certain animals get that way where it's there. Especially if you like are meal feeding, I think they get bored. And so they just eat it.
So with our cattle, you know, they'll get bored and they'll just eat
Yeah.
mineral. So one of the ways to do that is figure out this sack of mineral, how long that should last,
Yeah,
and then just don't give them, if it's supposed to last a month, don't give them any
yeah.
for a month. Can you do
Yeah.
that with sheep and goats?
You can. The only danger is that it's just like the feed. There might be
Some.
5 out of the 10 that are eating all that mineral, and then the other 5 aren't getting what they need. And that's why I just said, we're just gonna top dress everything and call it good. And which the same thing could be happening with the top dressing, but we give them a lot of bunk space, so we're hoping that
Everybody gets each other.
everybody gets some. But and then you hope spread out across multiple days that even if they didn't get it the one day, they're getting it the next day. But yeah, I've done it that way too, but I just always worry that there's gonna be the few that
didn't get any.
didn't.
I mean, we never had more than 5 or 6 goats, but,
Yeah.
so, you know, and everybody's got their own, there's more bunk in there as well.
Yeah,
So, and they don't get it every day, just, you know, from time to time. maybe.
Yeah. yeah, I think it's one of those, find what works for you, but it's just, to me, it's too costly to just leave it out there and keep it full.
Do you recommend separating the mineral from the salt and have free access to the salt and limit the mineral? No?
I don't. So the minerals we have, we actually mix it. It's it's just a loose mineral. It's from Premier. They just reformulated their mineral, and it's actually got increased selenium and zinc in it. So it's supposed to be really good if you have foot rot problems. And so far, it's been really good for foot rot problems. But you have to mix it with salt.
Oh,
So you mix one bag of it with a 50-pound bag of salt and then feed it over time. And so that's what we just scoop it out and put it over the feed, and then they're getting their salt and their mineral. So we just don't have to worry about it. And so far, we've had really good luck with the foot rot problems, and we're just now heading into that season. But in the fall, we had less foot rot than we had in years past. So I think they're all getting it, seems like. But I know some people do separate it. I don't have anything especially against that. But a lot of people are using the salt to limit their mineral, though. But I don't have any feelings one way or another. Okay, so this is another big one is sampling your hays. So that you know when you need to supplement. So as their requirements are going up, if you have no idea what your hay quality is, you don't really know what extra you need to feed, then you might start feeding too early or too much too early. And then I know a lot of people like protein tubs. My thing with protein tubs is kind of the same thing with mineral, is protein tubs are really expensive. And I've watched sheep eat them, and they just nail them. And all of a sudden, you've gone through 2 weeks worth of a protein tub in 1 week. And then people say that they need more. And so you can get sheep and goats pretty fat off of a protein tub pretty fast, especially if you just keep putting them out there. So they're not very good at limiting themselves on those protein tubs, in my experience. But I've only used one brand, so that's the only one I know about. But I've heard it with other brands too. So we actually ended up having to just make them limit. So we would pull the protein tubs out. We'd give them access to it for 8 hours of the day and then pull the protein tubs. And that seemed to actually get their consumption to where it was supposed to be. Okay, and then feed inventory management. So this probably isn't going to apply as much to you guys, but net wrapping versus twine as far as the loss of hay if you're feeding round bales, storing stuff on rock or cement so you don't get that loss, or tarping your hay, and if you have a bird problem, that can also cause some loss as well. But just making sure that your inventory is being taken care of. I know for us, we have cats that split open our feed sacks, so we have to be wary of that. And then we always have the classic bottom bales, because we have square bales. So the bottom bales, bottom quarter of them are moldy. So stuff like that, because that accounts for a lot of feed waste too. Okay, and then this one to me is huge for sheep and goats, but improving your grazing management. So most sheep and goats are going to be great at an intensive management grazing system. So whether you have cattle or if you have sheep and goats, being able to dual species graze is going to limit the amount of waste you have on pastures, because those different species are gonna utilize different grasses, different forbs that are available on pasture. And then rotating regularly so that those grasses can come back. You're also gonna limit your parasite infection rates. But you're gonna be able to utilize your pastures for a lot longer, typically. I'll skip that one. It's probably not. Anyone have crop residue they graze?
Trying to.
Trying to? Well, this is your potential savings if you can actually get that. So I would say if you have the opportunity, it's awesome to be able to do it because it can really extend your grazing season, reduce your cost. Fetal scanning, it's a great thing if you can incorporate it, so you can group your females if you're getting the fetuses aged. You can separate them by that. You can also separate them by singles, twins, triplets, or know if they're just open, and if you want to rebreed that female or color so you don't have to feed her the entire lambing or pregnancy cycle, and then find out at the end that she wasn't bred and you just fed her like bred you. Okay, changing your production system. So I know for some of you this also doesn't apply, but sometimes if we move our kidding or lambing later in the spring or even into fall, we're hitting a different market. But then we can also hopefully manage our forage quality, whether that's in that spring lambing or kidding, or even going into fall, depending on what we have available. Okay, I'll skip over labor. So other things you can do to cut costs is improving our pastures, whether that is anyone grazing like native, are y'all native pastures, or is it all improved?
Yeah,
You have native?
Boosted, yeah.
Okay. So for pasture improvement on the native side, doing the rotational grazing, especially if you can get sheep and cattle onto those pastures and grazing them at different times, you can really actually improve those native pastures. Or if we're doing improved pastures and seeding, there's different plants that the sheep or goats are going to utilize a lot more efficiently in those cases too. I don't know if any of y'all have a compost pile, but we actually just sold our compost pile for a decent amount of money to a landscape company. So ways that you sometimes don't think about making money. It's a great way to get a little bit of extra money. And then grazing other places that you don't necessarily think about. I know some people graze around dairy lagoons. Vineyards are a big deal. I've actually been trying to get into one of our vineyards that's close by in Manhattan, so that they don't have to use pesticides, herbicides, but we can put the sheep out there. Goats, don't recommend for a vineyard because they'll eat the leaves, and then you'll have a really, really mad vineyard on your hands. Ditches, there's lots of different options. And then of course agritourism is a great way to bring people in, educate them, but also charge a little bit and make some money. So I always include this because I don't think enough people body conditions for their sheep and goats. Sheep and goats are on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 is very skinny, 5 is very fat. On a 1, you'd be able to feel I almost knocked that off. All of the vertebrae from behind their rib cage. That's where you would start palpating. And then also their short ribs. So the short ribs are what's just behind those long ribs that make the rib cage. So you palpate those. And when you can feel all of the individual vertebrae and count them, and do the same thing with the short ribs and put your finger in between those short ribs, they're probably a 1 or very close to it. A 5, when you run your hand along their spine, you can't feel it. and you can't feel their short ribs because they're covered in fat. So when they're like that, they're probably a 5. On goats, this is a little different because goats tend to store fat internally, not externally. So sheep store fat externally, typically. And so we use this for goats too, but you want to pair it with also palpating their brisket or their sternum. And so a 1 on the sternum would be if you can fit your fingers, your hand all the way around the sternum, feel the base where the ribs are connecting, and really just count where that connection is. And a 5, typically you wouldn't be able to fit your hand around the sternum because it's just covered in fat.
What number are you shooting for?
So that's where this comes in. So at different, it's a little dark, sorry, but at different times of the year, different stages of production, you're going to be targeting different scores. So average is a 3. So when they're dry or maintenance level, anywhere from a 1.5 to a 2 is typically what people are going to shoot for. Most people don't like to see 1.5, so you're hardly ever going to see that. But most people would hover around a 2, 2.25 if they're actually doing the target body condition scores. And then at breeding, you would increase it because you're going to be flushing them. And you want to get at least a body condition score of 1 point improvement to get a good flush. So if you're at a 2, you want to get to a 3. So then they're going to be at a 3, and then going into early gestation, you actually can drop them back down to 2, 2.25, 2.5, because not much is actually required of them. They're pregnant, but I mean, for the first 20 days of pregnancy, they don't even know they're pregnant, so nothing is changing in their body. And so then when you get into mid-gestation, that's where you start increasing. So by late gestation, you want them 2.5 to a 3, even a 3.25. But when you get above that, that's when you start running into pregnancy toxemia and milk fever, all that kind of stuff. So early lactation, you actually want them to be gaining a little bit of body condition. And then, because this is their highest requirements right here. And then late lactation, they can start losing weight again, and they're fine. And then they'll be ready to just be at a maintenance level after that. So these are the 2 conditions. If you can even just maintain at a 3, that's usually what I tell people to start out. It's just don't pay attention to the up and down and trying to hit all those different numbers. It's just try and maintain them at a 3. Because that's a challenge in and of itself. It's just trying to maintain them at that. So, and if you can maintain them at a 3 and then get them up between a 3, 3.5 by late gestation, early lactation, then you're doing really good, and you're probably going to avoid most of these issues. I will say we maintain most of ours at between a 3, 3.5 in late gestation, and I had 2 with preg tox this year. I mean, out of almost 300 head, we had 2, so it's pretty good. And it was just after the cold weather. We started lambing and kidding the next week, and so we had 2 go down, but we saved them. It wasn't severe or anything, so, but keeping that condition score, and not just, the main thing is not letting them get too fat, can really save them from getting these conditions. Okay, I'll talk about this a little bit. So this just shows you so this is dry matter intake requirement, the green line, in pounds per head per day, for a doe or a ewe. And this is just average size, so you can go up or down from here, but this is just to show you from maintenance to flushing or breeding time, early, late gestation, early and late lactation, what their requirements are. So dry matter intake, it's going to go up at breeding because we're flushing them, and then go down during early gestation, and then it just keeps going up from late gestation into early lactation and comes back down. this black line is the energy requirement. So it's gonna do the same thing, goes up, comes back down during early gestation, goes up, comes back down. And then this is their protein requirement. So sheep and goats don't really have a huge protein requirement, but it's actually a thing that we overfeed a lot because we think they need it. So it goes up a little, just a tiny bit in the flushing stage, and then it'll start to creep back up in late gestation. Early lactation is their highest requirement, and it's still only about 1/2 pound per head per day. So it's never really that high throughout the year. And so that's another way that we can really cut cost, is by not overfeeding protein.
What about with dairy, the dairy goods? Does the protein change for them, or?
Yeah, so this is where I start to get out of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
Because I know that the amount of protein that you, this is how much I know. The amount of protein you feed affects the protein and the fat levels in the milk.
Right.
That's how much I know.
Okay.
I know it messes with it. And so I'm not gonna say anything
Okay.
beyond that because I don't wanna, do you have dairy goats? Okay. I know people that would know what to tell you.
Okay.
But I hesitate because when it gets to dairy stuff,
It's a
you
little
start
different.
messing with their milk, and
Yeah.
I don't want to mess up any of that because
Okay.
that's your cash crop. So, but I actually was working with our dairy extension specialist trying to come up with some rations for another dairy goat person, because that was my thing. I'm like, I don't want to do this and mess it up. So. But if you have a question about it,
Yeah.
I can work on it.
That'd be great.
I just can't answer it on
That's
the fly
okay.
because I just won't mess anybody up. So typically we can maintain our ewes and our does in the first part of gestation on either grass, hay, or pasture, depending on what we have available. If your pasture is low quality or starting to go dormant, depending on the time of the year, you might have to supplement on pasture. And then we typically start to supplement during mid-gestation into late gestation, and then start switching over to alfalfa hay with, we have like a brome prairie hay that we mix it with, and we start doing that in the last couple of months. So yeah, we supplement like a grower pellet, protein pellet, to our ewes, does during late gestation. And typically what I tell people is I add that on top as a supplement to those hays, and to maintain their body condition score. I have offered free choice mineral to my pregnant ewes and does late gestation. That is something that we typically do. We haven't been doing it since we switched mineral because this is just a much higher quality mineral than what we've been feeding. But beforehand, when I was feeding a lower quality mineral, we had it just out all the time during late gestation. Okay, so managing your flock, especially that ewe doe flock, is going to start way before you get into actual lambing or kidding season. And that's going to prevent a lot of preg tox, a lot of milk fever, maintaining those body condition scores like what I showed before. But it's also, and this is where we get to the production efficiency, cost of production stuff, is how those females are managed, how they're fed, is going to directly affect their offspring and how productive, how efficient they are. So we want to make sure that we're feeding them adequately. I'm not going to go over those graphs, but if you're interested in kind of messing around with some software and balancing rations and such, the top link is a great sheep ration balancer. Oklahoma State has a good meat goat ration balancer that's pretty simple to operate. I use one called Sheep Bites. It costs money. Those other ones are free. but it would actually have some dairy stuff on it, but it does cost money. I think it's $50 a year for producers, if you're interested. Okay, so I'm gonna have a little bit of stuff on genetics. But I'm gonna skip over that part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this just because, so on the technology side, I have the genetic stuff, but I'm not going to talk much about that tonight. So the National Sheep Improvement Program is who houses all the genetic information for sheep and goats in the U.S. So they generate EBVs, so not EPDs like in cattle, but EBVs for sheep and goats. It's very similar. And so you have to submit data, there's a cost for it. It's not a whole lot, but more and more people are starting to adopt it. But we can improve a lot of our production traits, efficiency traits. One of the biggest ones, I'll go back to this for a second. So this is one of the most interesting ones that I find it the most interesting, is in the Katahdin sheep breed. They were one of the earliest adopters of NSIP, or genetic selection, in sheep. And everyone always says about Katahdins that they're naturally parasite resistant, but it's actually not true. They just started selecting for it before anyone else did. And so this is the EBV for the fecal egg count. And so you want this one, it's one of the only EBVs you want to be low. So they started out way up here, this is back in 2005. And no one was really doing anything with it. And then all of a sudden, around 2010, they started really selecting for it and using NSIP. And all of a sudden, they started just kind of dropping. And so this is their parasitic infection rates. And then you can see like, oh, people, it's starting to work. We're really seeing something. And then everyone started doing it. And then it dropped drastically over just a couple of year period. And now they really are maintaining this negative EBV for parasite resistance, which is pretty cool. So a lot of producers, if they're on an SIP and selecting for this, a lot of them don't have to deworm because their sheep are genetically resistant to parasites. So it's pretty cool. Another one of the things, this is just another graph that they outputted from the Katahdin breed, but this is just overall output from a ewe. So this is another one, you want it to be positive, but this is pounds of output. So back in 2005, the average ewe was outputting about a little over 4 pounds per head. And then now, well, 2016, so this is actually kind of old, they're over 10 pounds per ewe. And that was just selecting for maternal ability to raise lambs, the pounds weaned per ewe, all that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of technology that is up and coming for the most part. It's not highly adopted yet, but we know it works. And with that, other technology, so I know some of y'all are smaller producers, but we have a lot of EID systems that more and more people are adopting. They are higher cost, but we can be much more efficient with that technology. Okay, I'll come back to that. I'm going to talk about parasites. Because 'tis the season for parasites. Okay, so I will say we are next week doing our last round of treatments for mites because our goats have mites every year. So we have to treat for it every year, and then they give it to our sheep now. So we just pour everything for mites. So this is my one slide on external parasites because they're typically not the problem and they're pretty easy to treat. So you can pour or inject. We can do it prior to lambing or kidding, depending on the drug, make sure it's safe. For wool sheep, you want to do it immediately after they've been shorn, just because then it's going to be able to reach the skin, and that's the main thing with any of it. The drug needs to penetrate the skin if it's a pour-on. So if you have goats with a lot of hair on them, you can make sure it gets below the hair. This is the two products I use the most, Ultra Boss, Ivomec Plus.
Ivomec Plus is injectable only?
Yeah.
How about the Ivomec Pour?
So you can use the Ivomec pour-on. We just use the if we go Ivomec, we use the injectable. This year, we're just using Ultra Boss for our mites. This is just mites. But you can use it to treat lice, ticks, whatever, but just for external parasites. Okay, so then when it comes to internal parasites, we have a lot. But the main two that we have major issues with are Haemonchus contortus, which is a strongyl type of parasite, and then coccidia. So coccidia can be a major problem, but it's typically easier to handle. We don't usually have drug resistance issues with coccidia. It's just once you have it, and it's a pain. So if you're out grazing, and that's the reason you're having parasite issues, which if it's internal parasite issues other than coccidia, it's typically going to come from grass. You want to make sure that your stocking density is not too high. So for most places, that's going to be between 6 to 8 head per acre. And that can vary, of course, depending on how you've been managing that grass and moisture levels, all that kind of stuff. The other thing is you don't want to graze it too low. So if we go below 4 to 6 inches of height, grass height, the larvae of those parasites can actually go above that or go up to that 4-inch, 5-inch mark. So if we graze below that, all of a sudden we're grazing where the parasites are. And then that's how the parasites get in the sheep or goat. And then that's how they reach maturity. And then once the sheep or goat poops them out, you've now reinfected that pasture. So we want to make sure we're not allowing that cycle to take place. One way is, depending on our pastures, you want to make sure that you are opening up the canopy. So you don't want your grasses to get too mature to where all of a sudden those fecal pellets are shielded from the sun, because the sun can help us get a kill off, chicken stuff. But if those fecal pellets dry out, sometimes you will have larvae die off. So our young animals and our old animals are going to be more prone to infection. But for the most part, when we talk about managing parasites, about 20% of the animals we have are harboring about 80% of the parasites. So if you can identify that 20%, we can do a lot better job managing parasites. New purchases, new animals, you want to make sure that those get quarantined for a little while, because you don't want them introducing new parasites to your flock, especially new parasites that might have a drug resistance problem. So I would say that's a good thing to ask someone if you're buying animals from them, is if they have had problems with deworming. Do they have to do it regularly? Have they been rotating drugs? Do they have a drug that just doesn't work for them anymore? Because if the drug that doesn't work for them is the one that works for you, you probably don't want what that sheep has or that goat has inside of it. Because now you're going to introduce a resistance problem into your flock. Weather stresses can lead to parasitic infection. So typically when we get a big rain, like if we get this rain, and then now it's going to be warm the rest of the week, we're probably going to have an explosion of parasites. They're all going to hatch. So beware. Because this is usually going to be that first round of infection. parasites love moisture and heat, so.
How long should you leave them in a pasture if you was wanting to control them with rotation? You leave them 2 days, 3 days, or less
Yeah,
than that?
depending on the size of the pasture. I mean, we have pretty big pastures, and for us, we're only leaving them 3 to 5 days. And so I always just pay attention to how tall the grass is. Once we get to where the majority of it is about that 5 inches high, I move them. So, and we have ours grouped where all of our wool sheep are in a grazing group, and all of our hair sheep and our goats are in a grazing group. And, you know, the hair sheep and the goats, the pastures that they're on look a lot different than what are the ones the wool sheep are on, just because their grazing behaviors are a lot different. But, so.
In what way? In what way are they different?
So the wool sheep tend to graze the forbs, and so you're gonna see the impacts on pasture a lot sooner with the wool sheep than you do with the goats. Especially, we have some pastures that have a lot more browsing available. So when they're in those pastures, sometimes I can leave those hair sheep and the goats on a pasture for a week, where I might only be able to leave the wool sheep on that pasture for, 4 or 5 days, just because the wool sheep are gonna do a lot more grazing than those hair sheep and the goats. But it depends on the pasture, too. I mean, ours aren't true native pastures, ours are kind of mixed. And a lot of the true native pastures, you know, the sheep and the goats are gonna do a lot more damage to your forbs. The hair sheep and the goats are gonna do a lot more damage to those forbs, especially if there's a lot more of the, I don't wanna call them weeds, but taller plants that have a lot more seed heads and stuff available. And that's where grazing is so dependent on the pasture type. I mean, if it's straight fescue, a goat is gonna do a lot different on that straight fescue pasture than a native pasture. And so is a hair sheep, and so is a wool sheep. A wool sheep can it'll look like a carpet if you let it. Let's see. Okay, any individuals that are immunosuppressed, so the older sheep or goats, and then when we get into pregnancy, so late pregnancy is typically where we're going to see a lot of parasitic infection or a large rise in our parasitic infection up until 8 weeks after landing and kidding. So, like I said, right now, I don't know when you all have landed and are kidded, but if you're on our cycle, we're right at this, about 6 weeks post-delivery. So we're gonna be hitting this really well to get a nightmare for parasitic infection. Okay, so on the drug side of things, almost all of our drugs are related. So you don't currently recommend rotating dewormers, so you want to use one until it doesn't work and then swap. That's the current recommendation. I have no new drugs are being made. There actually is a new drug out of New Zealand that has been made, but it is not available here. And I don't know if it will be available here ever. So I would not say to look forward to that. But typically there's no better dewormers or no broad spectrum dewormers. There's just the dewormers that work for you and your operation, and just because it works for your neighbor doesn't mean it will work for you. So it's really important to identify the one that is going to be most advantageous for you to use. This is another one. No drug has ever or will ever achieve a 100% kill, but you don't want it to. You want worms around. You just want them to be the type that you can control. And I'm going to harp on this a lot, but we do have a drug resistance problem, and it's pretty major. But it happens. It's a natural thing to occur. But we as humans have sped up the problem just from misuse. Okay, so these are usually the most common questions, is do I need to deworm more often? Do I need to up the dosage? And the answer is no. The worst thing you could probably do is actually deworm more often. And just because you give a higher dose does not mean it's going to be more effective. You want to use the dosage that the label says. So we have a few different ways we can test. This first one is the drench right test. So you do a fecal composite sample from across your flock. So either 10% of the group or 10 of the animals, whichever number is more. So you just have a big ball of manure from your flock. You send that in. This test is done at the University of Georgia. That's the only place that I know of that does that test. And they will give you the best dewormer for your flock, and then help you evaluate how to manage the parasites in your flock moving forward. You can also do this test if you just have a few individuals that you continually have problems with, and composite those, or just actual individual animals, and send that in as well. The second test is the fecal egg count reduction test. Most vet clinics will do this test. K-State does this test. And so you actually do the test, deworm, and then do the test 14 days later. And they will verify what drugs are going to have or be the most effective. You do have to have a certain number of eggs per gram for this test to work, so you actually have to have a parasite infection. If there's below a certain number, they can't actually do the test. But if you're below that certain number, you probably don't have a problem, which is great. They will hopefully be able to tell you how to lower or reduce the amount of infection that you have. And hopefully be able to tell you what your resistance is to certain drugs. But I will say this, most of the lack of efficacy that we have when we do these sorts of tests, of course we can have the resistance problem, but a lot of times it's because we're not using the proper dosage, whether that's just a misuse from the label or we don't know the weight of the animal, so we're not giving the proper dosage. Sometimes it's a route problem, so the route of drug administration, because some people like to give borons as an injectable or injectables as a boron or drench. That's not how they were intended to be given, so they're not going to be as effective. And then sometimes it's a drug problem. Sometimes it's actually because some of these are oil-based, and so the drug can settle out, so if you don't shake it, the drug is not actually suspended in the oil. So you want to make sure that, this is where I always say, just read the label, because the label will tell you. But one of the most effective ways we have to manage parasites is outside of the drug realm, but using FAMACHA. So FAMACHA is another 1 to 5 scale. This method was developed in South Africa, actually in goats mostly, but also in sheep. And you actually are looking at the bottom inside membrane of the eyelid. I don't know if you can see it in this picture, but that's the eye. So they're looking at the bottom inside part of that eyelid. A 1 would, hopefully you can kind of see these colors. 1 is super, super red. The 5 is creamy pale white. So we're just looking at the anemia level of that animal. So this is mainly intended for Haemachus contortus, or the barber pole worm, because it's a blood-sucking worm. So this is going to be most effective for those types of parasites. It can sometimes identify other parasite problems, but it was intended for the barber pole worm, because globally that's the main issue, is that type of worm. So a 5 is going to be a super anemic animal, and hopefully you can see this, but a 1 and a 2, there's a check mark above those numbers, and it means you don't need to treat those animals. A 3, there's a question mark and a little drench gun. So a 3 is questionable, and it depends on your management system. You could treat that animal if you want or not. I can tell you when I've used FEMACHA, when I've had major issues, we weren't treating 3s. So we chose to not treat the 3s because we were really cracking down on our issue. And this was in Georgia, so it was a big problem. And we were only going to treat the 4s and the 5s. And if something came in as a 3, we would record it and not treat. And then 2 weeks later, we'd bring them in again. And if it was still a 3, that's great. If it was a 4, then I would treat it and we would record that. But if something just continually came in as a 3, I don't really have an issue with that, because if she can maintain herself at a 3 and it not drag her down production-wise, then hey, she's shedding a bunch of parasites that are probably going to not have a resistance problem because I'm not having to treat her. And so then hopefully those parasites are breeding with other parasites that might have a resistance problem. And so then hopefully those two parasites breeding together, we're going to have more parasites that don't have a resistance problem. So I tell people, when you're managing parasites, you have to think about breeding parasites, not sheep or goats. And what are you putting back out on the pasture? So that's where you have to make a personal management decision. 4s and 5s have a drench gun. A 4 has an exclamation point. That means you need to treat that animal. And a 5 has a skull and crossbones and a drench gun. Because if that animal goes untreated, it will likely die from a parasitic infection. So we need to treat those. But the main thing with FEMACHA is that you're recording what you're doing and what their number is. And then the next time you bring them in, what they're doing, if you're treating them or not, and what their number is. And when we were really cracking down on it, if we had a repeat offender of a 4 or 5, they were gone. Because they're your problem. They're that 20% of the flock that's harboring the parasites and just infecting everybody else. So it depends on how harsh you want to be. But for us, we had a really big problem. Now, if I have to treat something 3, 4 times, they're out. I'm not quite as hard on them, but they're the ones causing the problem. So with the internal parasites, like I said, you don't want to 100% kill off. You want that manageable number of worms and a manageable number of animals that are going to be susceptible to treatment. Okay, so this is a bunch of different resources. Like I said, I will get this to you so that everyone has it. The top one is the genetics website, if you're interested in looking at that more. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. The second one, Lifetime Ewe Management, has a ton of information about managing females. So it's all about, it's sheep information, but it's very applicable to the goat side as well. This is that app I mentioned before that's now just a website. YO Ranch Tools, this website is a cost of production website. So you can actually, they have a tool where you can go in and actually input numbers and it will calculate your cost of production for you. K-State has some pretty decent little tools for calculating cost of production as well. And then Parasite, anything you could ever want to know about managing parasites in small ruminants is on this website. I jokingly say that I could read an article from this website every day for the rest of my life and I would not finish. So there's a ton of information. And it's a great website. And then this last one is a newer one for me, but it's a website on targeted grazing. And there's a lot of small ruminant information, but also grazing small ruminants with cattle and incorporating them into different production systems and just how to manage grazing operations. So it appears to be a very great website that I haven't had a lot of time yet to look into.